Welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. Let us help you escape your mind.
All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 250 today. What a great episode to be 250 landing on here. So we have Bobby Azarian on, who wrote the book, The Romance of Reality, and it's phenomenal. I highly recommend it. It covers a lot of the themes that we discuss on the show normally, and it gives kind of credence to some of the theories that are already out there, but adds a new spin on it, and a more interesting spin, I should say. There's a lot of good hard science in there, as well as some interesting speculation, and I just really recommend it. So go check that book out down below. I have the link. He also did a wonderful episode on Joe Rogan about a month back, so I recommend people go check that out as well. Before we get started, if anybody wants to support the show, I'm not going to go through the whole spiel. We have the LinkTree link down below. We've got a merch store. We've got Patreon. We've got you name it. And also, I just added a new thing onto our YouTube. So if you want to get the exclusive content that we normally put on our Patreon, I'm also going to be including that on our YouTube channel, so you can sign up through that way. It's just $2 a month, the same thing as our Patreon. So go check that out. Also, if you want to leave us a nice review on Spotify or Apple Podcast, we really appreciate that. That's a good way to support the show. We are just looking forward to this conversation. And again, the book is The Romance of Reality. I have the link down below. He also has a Substack and a called The Road to Omega. And I'll add the link after we're done with that as well. But welcome on the show, Bobby. How are you?
Thanks for having me. Great.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so I saw you on Rogan, and I'm like, we got to get this guy on. This guy's talking about all the stuff we normally talk about on the podcast. And you can tell that you did your homework and you put a lot of thought and effort into this book. How long did it take you to write the book?
It took about 2.5 years maybe, including the editing phase. But these thoughts had been brewing for probably a decade. Maybe even closer to 2 decades if, I go back to being an undergraduate and being a science major who was really interested in philosophy and reading, lots of books about, evolution, life, cosmology, books like David Deutsch's The Fabric of Reality. So it was something that I knew I wanted to do, but I guess in grad school, I got a little bit more serious about trying to acquire all the knowledge I would need to tell the story. And then in 2015, after I got my PhD, I started doing science journalism. So I was freelancing and pitching all kinds of articles, but a lot of those articles helped shape the ideas in the book. So it's kind of like a lifelong project. But for 2 years, I was focused almost exclusively on the book.
Awesome. Yeah. There's. I find what's interesting is you were very kind of critical, or you critique the idea of like materialist or dogmatic scientism, kind of in a way, and I really appreciate that as coming from your background, because I think that when you look at science, especially some of the more biology or evolution or these different branches, it can get kind of like just looking at the mechanics of things as opposed to the phenomenology aspect of it. And I think that that's what's missing in most of science now, is like, I think that's why people latch on to some of the more woo or crazier ideas of things, is because they don't have that like philosophical underpinning of what scientists communicate currently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's problems on both sides, but both sides are doing something good at the same time. But it became kind of trendy I guess I think Stephen Hawking was responsible for making a comment like this, and then Neil deGrasse Tyson would echo it on like these like late night shows. But basically, that science didn't need philosophy, and I think that's a really bad idea. And I think most of our greatest scientists from history understood that philosophy is this big part of science. Science only knows what we know at the time, and there's a lot of stuff out there that we don't know. We should never make the mistake of thinking that we know everything right now. That's kind of the mistake people have always made in the past, to think like, oh, we're living in modern times and we know everything. There's a ton of shit we don't know, and we have to kind of have a method for trying to get at what we don't know, and that's what philosophers do. So science needs philosophy, but at the same time, you have people who are interested in these things, but don't have the discipline that scientists have, as far as like being skeptical, and that can open a person up to a world of supernatural beliefs that might not be true and might not be helpful for coping with everyday life. So science needs religion and philosophy, but religion and philosophy also need science to kind of guide it.
No, 100%. That's something we preach on the show, and we always talk about, Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions. And I feel like we're in one of those bottlenecks right now. We have people studying psychedelics. We have people studying the nature of consciousness. We have people like you coming up with theories of everything kind of a thing. And I think that, whether it leads to, like you said, I don't think we'll ever get to that end point. I think that's the whole point. We're all Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain for the next person. But I think we can do a better job of listening to each other. And like you mentioned, using our minds, not just observation. And I think that that's huge. So one of your, the main themes early in your book is kind of this idea of abiogenesis, but not the abiogenesis that we've kind of heard. What's that guy, Clark, or not Clark, from Stanley something from the University of California, San Diego, who did that experiment where he put everything in a bottle and it had all the ingredients, what they thought the earth was like at the time. So that's why people thought, that's how the way we've thought about abiogenesis. But you kind of had a very, very interesting take on it, which is correlated to the second law of thermodynamics. So why don't you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, so the experiments you mentioned just showed that if you put like precursor molecules to organic chemistry in like a flask, and then just like subject it to like some sparks, that you can get like molecules that are somewhat complex, like amino acids. It's really easy to generate amino acids. So at the time, it was thought maybe that was a breakthrough, that you just need something like a strike of lightning hitting like a pond that has all these right molecules. But scientists learned really quickly that the next steps, like getting to actually like a self-replicating system, which needs some sort of genetic information. It also needs something to do the task of what proteins would do to take that genetic information and build the system. So so we haven't made life in the lab yet, and until we do that, I think we can't really say that we completely understand the origin of life. But we're getting a new picture of how life might have emerged based on a field called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. So most of us have heard of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy increases. Non-equilibrium thermodynamics is taking the same type of just taking the same foundational ideas and applying them to organized systems. And organized systems resist this tendency towards disorder described by the second law of thermodynamics. And so non-equilibrium thermodynamics is interested in asking how systems manage to sustain themselves, to stay ordered, to persist in this world that otherwise becomes increasingly disordered. And the thing that scientists found out how life is able to do this And it was the quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger who really popularized this in his book called What is Life? The guy with the cat experiment that everyone knows about, the thought experiment. So he wrote a very important book on biology, and it actually gave Francis Crick and Watson the idea of what to look for. So discovering the DNA molecule, the double helix, was inspired by this book. Anyway, Schrödinger said that living systems can evade this tendency towards disorder because they're not closed off to the environment. And that second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems. But living systems are open systems. That means they can extract energy from the environment, and that energy can be used to do work. And that physical work is sustaining itself against this tide of increasing entropy. So life always has to find energy in its environment to stay ordered. And for humans, that's food. For plants, it's sunlight. They do photosynthesis. We have metabolism, and we can basically exist in this world as an organized structure, as a sentient system, by doing this little game where we're always out there searching for energy. And then later, as life gets more complex, there's other things that life has to worry about. We have to avoid threats, and we have to maintain our stable organization in the face of a harsh and chaotic world. So we build order, we build structures around us that helps maintain that order. And that's really what the nature of life is from this perspective. Life is a system that is always acquiring information about its environment through adapting. And so it's this information processing system, this little computer that has to always get energy from its environment in order to stick around.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And one thing you mentioned a few times earlier in your book is the idea of free energy that, as you mentioned, it's always finding a way to get this free energy. You also discussed, you go into depth about, like the chicken and the egg thing, about like cell replication. You also go into DNA, RNA, proteins, lipids. But one thing I found very interesting would be the idea, I think you mentioned 1977 was when they discovered those hydrothermal vents, and the idea that there was these, what did you call them? Reductive autotrophs? Is that what they're called?
Yeah. Chemoreductive autotrophs. Yeah, they're just really simple organisms that basically...
Is that considered an extremophile, or is that not even to that level?
I think it would be.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's really, really hot down there next to those vents. They're basically these underwater volcanoes, and they're thought to be the new the location for the origin of life. We don't know, but I think the basic idea that it's going to be somewhere where water and solid material with the atoms needed for organic chemistry, it's going to be somewhere like that, and there needs to be energy flowing through the system. So it could be a freshwater hot spring. There's another competing hypothesis that this happened in freshwater because maybe ocean water, salty water might provide some difficulties for some of these organization mechanisms to happen.
Geothermal features, almost like, what's that, like Yellowstone or something like that?
So there are these rocky pores, and I forget the actual molecular makeup of the pores, but basically there's hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and sulfur and phosphorus, and you have lots of heat flowing through these systems, and that heat kind of provides like energy for a molecular system to move through a sequence of configurations. And this process that has been called dissipative adaptation basically says that energy flowing through these systems naturally will organize that system, because the system will reconfigure itself to be able to extract that incoming energy better. And the idea is that these rocky pores could have played the role of like a lipid membrane, like cells are surrounded by this fatty tissue and it keeps all the stuff inside, but maybe it got started in a pore and you just had this simple chemical reaction set that's called an autocatalytic set. But basically you can have a complex system form from simple molecules if you have energy flowing through the system. And basically those molecules in an autocatalytic set will create like a self-amplification process where the system grows larger.
Interesting. Yeah, in terms of that, I found that very fascinating. And then you also go into like what would be needed, which would be geothermo, geochemical, and you would need magma, seawater, and rock minerals to initiate that.
Yeah, some origin of life researchers have boiled it down to being like a wet, rocky, sunny planet. But yeah, you would need specifically like the location would have to have like lots of energy flowing through this molecular system. And if you have that, it's not this improbable thing that requires like a humongous amount of luck. Because the old idea was that, you know, the problem with explaining life and why it seems so improbable was you need thousands of molecules to do what a self-replicating system needs to do. And the idea was that those all came together in just some collision. And that would be extremely unlikely to have all of the right molecules fall together at one moment. That's called the chance assembly hypothesis. But now we know it didn't happen that way. You have a small system, you have energy flowing through the system over time, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. And it starts to basically organize those molecules into a larger aggregate and basically just keeps, you know, pushing the system in the direction of increasing complexity. And so it's this gradual process that happens. And once you understand that, then you realize it wasn't this highly improbable cosmic accident. It was part of this natural process, but it only happens on those planets where the conditions are right. So it's not going to be everywhere because, for example, other planets in our solar system don't have the right conditions. But in other solar systems, other galaxies, there's lots of these exoplanets. And basically, when you have those conditions, the new thinking is that it should cook up life. You have the ingredients, it's going to emerge. And it has kind of interesting philosophical or spiritual implications, I'd say, because basically it says we're not an accident. We're a natural manifestation of the laws of physics and the evolutionary dynamics that emerge from those laws. And that kind of changes our perspective on our relationship to the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with that. I think that when you look at like Richard Dawkins and this idea that it is some sort of cosmic accident, I never really liked that at all. And I think it's kind of dismissive. And actually, from like a philosophical standpoint, you know, you could make the argument, well, then what's the point of life? Like, you know, the teleological explanation for me would be that life is trying to survive, like you're saying. So it goes through this process. So there is purpose, even if it's just to survive. So I don't like the cosmic accident argument on that. But you mentioned too, like for the metabolic cycles, you need nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, phosphorus, and all that. How have you ever really fully considered panspermia, or the idea that maybe we were seeded with these organic compounds or things necessary to create this cosmic soup that led to us, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, panspermia is possible, but I think if it happened somewhere else, it would still have occurred according to this dissipative adaptation mechanism.
Well, yeah,
Because
because
it's
you're passing off the right. It's you're not even
yeah,
really explaining life. You're just passing it off and saying, "Oh, that's just how it got here." You know.
exactly. So yeah, if that's shown to be true, that is fine. And I think, but yeah, of course, it leads to the same question: like, how did it arise on that other planet? And so this mechanism would be the explanation of how life can get going, not by this vastly improbable mechanism, but by something that happens gradually and expectedly when you have energy flowing through the system and pushing it what's called far from equilibrium. And equilibrium would be a state of like just complete chaos and everything's mixed up, all of the molecules, there's no patterns. That's a state of thermodynamic equilibrium. And so life basically maintains this ordered state that non-equilibrium thermodynamics calls a far from equilibrium state.
Interesting. One of the most interesting things, though, I found was this part where you were talking about, again, we were talking about abiogenesis, would be the early days, the Earth overproducing this chemical energy in these chemical energy reservoirs, and it didn't have that balance to do anything with all of that free energy, as you mentioned. And then this caused the thermodynamic instability, and it needed some sort of balance. Hence, you said it like interjects back into itself and starts to reorganize, and that's where you start to get some of this complexity that leads to cells. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Eric Smith and Harold Morowitz of the Santa Fe Institute have done a lot of kind of groundbreaking origin of life research. And the way they explain it is that there were these like energy reservoirs, like this buildup of free energy and like geochemical energy. Basically, energy had nowhere to flow. And that creates a sort of thermodynamic imbalance, a sort of pressure. And that what life is basically a flow path for that energy, and organic chemistry opens up a whole new domain of chemistry where energy can flow and release that pressure where it couldn't before. So the idea is that an Earth with life is actually more stable than a lifeless Earth with those kinds of thermodynamic conditions.
Interesting. You mentioned Sarah Walker, who, she's into, extraterrestrial life and all similar things, and Lee Cronin as well, who's into chemical analysis of life and origins. And they came up with this idea of assembly theory. Have you read their paper? And if so, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was just reading that last night, actually. I think it's a good approach. I think we'll learn a lot from it. I do think that we kind of need to understand this non-equilibrium thermodynamics narrative and how like that story of molecular self-assembly fits into this story of dissipative adaptation. So Sarah Walker's familiar with these mechanisms. She actually reviewed the book by the two scientists I just mentioned, Eric Smith and Harold Morowitz, which talk a lot about this. But she's said, sometimes she's mentioned that she didn't think non-equilibrium thermodynamics is enough, that we need information theory to really understand like the nature of life. And that's true. Those two sciences are kind of two sides of the same coin. But I do think when she talks about life, like on recent interviews, there's a lot that she's missing conceptually that come from the non-equilibrium thermodynamics work, this like dissipative adaptation process that I think would kind of like prune the theory, the self-assembly theory, such that like, some of the ideas that don't fit into this thermodynamic picture would kind of like be discarded from that, and you would get a clear picture of the actual origin of life. So yeah, maybe you can have us both on sometime if you can.
Yeah,
you can get her. You can get her to come on. Yeah,
host a friendly chat / debate.
Absolutely.
So, your background, you're a neuroscientist, correct?
Yes.
In the book, you discuss kind of your interest, though, in all these other things. You even mentioned it. What did you call it? Where it's kind of not like a polymath, but I forget. You mentioned there was a term for it. You mentioned for scientists.
I might have referred to my old professor who I mentioned, Harold Morowitz, as a polymath. He definitely was, and he's what kind of motivated me to try to write a book with such large scope.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Yeah. To write a book with such large scope. So he wrote a book called The Emergence of Everything, and it was just a big picture view of how like everything emerged from like stars and galaxies to life to, culture to language, tool making, all of these things. So, yeah, I think it's an era where generalists are just as important or more important than specialists. So in science, you have all these people who are specialists. They're trained to be specialists. The kind of the structure of the academic system kind of forces them to stay specialists, because it's just this game about publishing as many papers as you can in your field. And I think now to understand like these big questions, like what's the origin of life, what's the origin of consciousness, how is consciousness created, that you have to have not an expert understanding, but at least like a basic understanding of all the sciences and all of the philosophies that inform science. So philosophy of mind, philosophy of science. And so, yeah, that's what the book tries to do, is explain life and consciousness and intelligence and where life ultimately is going in the universe, basically by understanding evolution in these new terms, in terms of thermodynamics or energy flows and information theory. So the idea is that life basically is a computational system that encodes knowledge about the outside world, and as life evolves, this island of knowledge grows and grows, and as life acquires more knowledge, it becomes better at manipulating the universe around it, and inevitably it will spread outward from its planet of origin, given enough time.
Yeah, that's
Nice.
super fascinating. So I think like 2 or 3 years ago, we had this author on, Jude Currivan. She wrote the Cosmic Hologram, and she was saying something similar to what I've been thinking, and now you're saying it too, which is the whole entropy thing. So the entropy definition or explanation in regards to the universe is that it goes from order to disorder. But that doesn't make sense from a complex system standpoint, or if you look at the organization of life and that kind of a thing. And her thing was more of, obviously everything, everything's kind of made out of nothing in a way, and it's all a hologram. And that her thing was that, there's this data set and everything's based off of data, and the data becomes more complex, more organized. So it's actually, entropy is the opposite of what's been explained as in the past. And I don't think that's exactly what you're saying, but it's kind of along the lines of what you're saying. So, I mean, again, I when I heard initially, when I understood what entropy was, I'm like, that doesn't make sense. So can you explain, the original model of entropy and then kind of where we're at now with it?
Yeah, so it would be hard to speak to that theory, because I don't know exactly what she was saying about it. But yeah, I have a friend, an author, great author of books like of the same sort of big cosmic nature. One was called The Lucifer Principle, another was The Global Brain, another was The God Problem. Howard Bloom, and he's been on Joe Rogan and says he doesn't believe in entropy, and he thinks the concept's wrong. And I understand what people mean when they say that, because this concept that the universe is becoming more disordered is wrong. But the concept of entropy is like a specific thing that we use to measure, for example, so there's different types of entropies that measure different types of things, but you can have a type of entropy that measures the disorder or chaos in a system, or the randomness, basically in a completely chaotic system where molecules are all just moving at random. That's high entropy and high disorder. System where you have these molecules and they're statistically correlated with each other. Maybe they're bonded together by some chemical forces and they maintain that structure. Yeah, so the second law of thermodynamics has a really complicated history. But first, it was just about basically heat flow. And the idea was that, we all experience this every day. So if you have like a hot bath, it'll cool to a warm temperature, to room temperature over time, until everything, like the surrounding air and the water, both reach a mutual uniform temperature. Your cup of coffee cools. So yeah, heat spreads out. And basically that mechanism was used to power steam engines. And so people were trying to understand steam engines, and you could basically heat a liquid up by burning coal under it, and then it would expand and push what's called a piston, and that would create a force that could power a locomotive, and then they would cool it, and it would come back, and then they would heat it again. So this cyclical process. So that's kind of how the second law of thermodynamics was born. This idea that heat spreads out, that was one thing, but they also realized that when they're doing this process, um, um, the energy that gets converted basically from the heat into mechanical energy, every time you do that process, it dissipates some of that energy in the form of heat. So, our bodies are always giving off heat. Our computers are giving off heat. Any physical process, friction creates heat. So mechanical processes dissipate a little bit of energy, and then that energy is still there, but it's spread out in the jostling of molecules, and you can't harness that energy to do work anymore. And so entropy at first was just a measure. It was of the quantity of energy no longer available from work to do work. So it was just spread out energy. And then Ludwig Boltzmann came along. So that was like earlier 1800s, or like 1840s, and then Boltzmann was probably around like 1870s or 1880s. And he was trying to understand the second law from the perspective of like imagining all of the little molecules moving around. And he created this science called statistical mechanics. And he was trying to explain the flow of heat spreading out in terms of molecular interactions. And basically it was shown that heat is really, if you zoomed in what heat is, it's like the molecules moving more excitedly. It's just more rapid motion. And so he showed that, a gas in a closed box, if it's like in an organized state, it will slowly spread out and become more disordered. So it would go from like an ordered state to a mixed up state. And that was kind of a statistical interpretation of the second law. And then so people started to understand it, entropy, not as this measure of energy unavailable for work, but as disorder in a system. And then so that's a whole different kind of entropy, though, because you can then talk about, like, for example, like a bag of M&Ms, and you have the colors organized, and then you mix the bag up, and then you could talk about, that system is becoming more entropic because it's more mixed up and there's no more patterns. But there's really not much going on as far as like the original thermodynamic thing when we're talking about like the spread out, energy getting spread out. So basically there's multiple types of entropy. Entropy in one sense means disorder. That only applies to closed systems like a gas in a box. If a system is open, then it can keep staying ordered as long as it gets energy from the environment. But then it takes that energy and it uses that energy and it dissipates that energy and spreads it out as heat. And that increases entropy in the first sense of the original idea of entropy. So entropy is still going up. And some people have tried to combine these two types of entropy, and because in some ways they're talking about the same thing, but they go, oh, entropy is still going up because you took ordered energy like from the sun and then you dissipated it and created this disordered energy. And that's true, it's spreading out energy, but when you create heat, there's no disorganization. If you're looking at the large scale structure of the universe and you have these pockets of life that are expanding by extracting the energy around it, creating heat isn't structural disorder. It's like basically they're doing this trick to make the disorder theme work by talking about two different types of disorder: structural disorder and energetic disorder. And so entropy goes up because the energy is getting used and dissipated, but basically organization can grow until that whole energy supply is used. And there's some scientists like David Deutsch who think that maybe that energy supply isn't finite, and that as the universe expands, and if the universe is infinite and more matter comes into the horizon, that's more free energy for life to use to sustain itself. He's also, along with like Stuart Kauffman, who's a complexity scientist, some of these big names have talked about ways in which the expanding universe, pushed by this mysterious dark energy force, perhaps dark energy could be used to be the free energy source that allows life to sustain itself. So this idea of a heat death, it's being challenged. It's no longer the assumption that our universe is dying. It seems to be growing more organized. As long as life can capture the free energy in its surroundings, it can sustain itself. And there doesn't seem to be a limit necessarily on that free energy. We know that every star in the sky is a big battery for life. And basically, the lifetime of our star, the fact that our sun will die in about 4 billion years, creates something like a game clock for any intelligent species. We know that we must expand if we're to continue to persist. And this is going to become more obvious to us the closer we get to that deadline and the smarter we get, because the smarter we get, the more farther into the future we look and the farther into the future we care about. So spreading through space is a biological necessity, but it's also what any advanced civilization will do if they want to keep progressing, because they still need energy. If they're this virtual, if they're this technological society that's experiencing all of these things in like digital and virtual realms, that hardware is still real in the world and it needs to be powered. So even like post-human, intelligence would still need to continue expanding through the universe, because it needs to have energy to power its computation. And every star in the sky is like a big battery for life. So the book basically argues that the way that the Earth was once not covered with life, and then life emerged, and now it dominates the planet, it's going to spread through the universe and dominate the universe in the same sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something I think about regularly. I actually go back to like advanced environmental science in high school. We did this experiment, and it's basic, with fruit flies, and you put them in a bottle, and they'll reproduce, and at some point they'll run out of resources, and they'll all die. Do you see that as potential? Because we're mentioning earlier, I was talking about the chemical reservoirs and all that free energy, but it seems like we could get in trouble with the opposite of that, meaning that maybe there's not enough, or maybe we just haven't figured it out yet, but maybe at some point there wouldn't be enough energy on this planet for everyone. And as you mentioned, we would have to get off of it. Otherwise we would, succumb to what I was talking about.
Yeah, it creates an imperative. So existential challenges are good. They're good for progress. Without it, it would just come to some sort of stable equilibrium and life would not go anywhere, because it wouldn't have to do anything that would require that it become more advanced, intelligence-wise and technologically. So we need these challenges, and I think it is a natural part of this, system that we call the universe, that basically has this tendency towards disorder, and it also has this tendency to form organized systems that resist that tendency towards disorder. So it's almost like life is something like an AI, and it's learning from these challenges that the universe is giving it, in the same way that you might have a chess playing computer program that you keep, letting it play like human players, and it keeps learning and learning. It keeps losing and losing, but every time it loses, it's encoding those patterns. It's encoding that knowledge and using it in the future. And over time, it becomes impossible to kill. So, so the story about energy on Earth and whether we're going to run out. We had certain sources of energy, like, sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
It's all right.
So, so we need to eat food, as I said, to stay in existence. But we also use energy to power everything we do. And when we unlocked fossil fuels, that led to this big revolution. Steam engines, when we unlocked the power of, heat energy, so like thermal energy, and then later nuclear energy. So all of these things are examples of us unlocking energy reservoirs that were there that could do tons of work, tons of computation. And so people always, tend to think that the resources are limited, but really they're limited only until there's a paradigm shift or some groundbreaking discovery that allows you to unlock a whole new source of energy that you didn't even know existed. So the world around us is a vast ocean of free energy. And if you buy this argument that life, in the book I call Life Adaptive Complexity, because it's a network of complex adaptive systems that's integrated into one larger system, and it just learns. That's like the essence of what it does. It experiments and learns from its failures. It's always self-correcting. If you buy that picture, then basically you look at the universe as this computational system.
All right, folks. So yeah, we were having some technical difficulties. I'm going to try and find out what the source of these issues is, and go from there. We're going to have Bobby back on in the near future. It was a fascinating conversation. I recommend everybody go check out his book, The Romance of Reality. Super interesting book, especially if you like science and physics and consciousness and stuff like that. I highly recommend it. So go check that out. I have the link down below, but we are going to have Bobby back on in the near future for part 2. If you want to support our show, please check out our LinkTree link, and we've got Patreon on there. We've got, you name it, merch store, all sorts of stuff. And if you want to support the show, just leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But I just wanted to let everybody know, we love everybody. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.